Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 223, A Diet of Worms in 1495. We're now 7 episodes into the action-packed life of Emperor Maximilian, and he's only 35 years old. We still have another 24 years to go, and they will be again full of wars and outlandish schemes, including one where he wants to make himself pope, and of course marriages that create an empire. But if you look into German history schoolbooks, the thing that Maximilian is most famous for is what we'll discuss today. The Imperial reforms that start in earnest in 1495, and they will go through some iterations before being largely completed in 1555. So of these 1495 reforms, the Ewige Landfrieden, the eternal peace, is the most impactful. And it begins as follows, quote, "From this moment on, no person of whatever rank, status or condition shall make war on others, or rob, declare feud with, invade or besiege them, or help anyone else to do so in person or through servitors, or violently occupy any castle, town, market, fortress, village, farmstead or hamlet, or seize them illegally against another's will, or damage them with fire or in any other way, or assist by word or deed, or in any other way support or supply any perpetrators of such deeds, or knowingly harbour, house, feed, or give drink, aid, and comfort to such persons." That sounds great. Who could possibly disagree with that? Why did it take months and months of negotiations to agree this? Well, let's find out. First up, why was reform suddenly needed? It is hard to nail down a point in time when things went really wrong for the Holy Roman Empire. It might have been as long ago as 1077, when the Emperor Henry IV had to kneel before the Pope in Canossa. Or was it in 1166, when the great army of imperial vassals died in the mud and shit outside the walls of Rome? Or was it the sword that murdered Philip of Swabia in 1208 that was the last of the 1,000 cuts? But whatever event you choose, by 1495 the empire had been in dire straits for centuries. As friend of the podcast Silvio Aeneas Piccolomini said to the imperial princes, "You acknowledge the emperor for your king and master. Nevertheless, he possesses but a precarious sovereignty. He has no powers. You only obey him when you choose, and you're seldom inclined to obey. You are all desirous to be free. Neither the princes nor estates render to him what is due. He has no revenues, no treasure. Hence you are involved in endless contests and daily wars. Hence you suffer rapine, murder and conflagrations, and 1,000 evils which arise from divided authority." End quote. When there are no powerful central institutions, law and order collapses. As one chronicler said, when the cat is away, the mice govern as they will. And what these mice liked, even more than cheese, was other people's cheese. Feuding was endemic. There weren't just the major conflicts like the Mainzer Stiftsfehde or the Princes' War. There were lots and lots and lots of little fights, in particular in the south where the political power was particularly fragmented. It is the scale of it that is so shocking. Peter Wilson counted that between 1440 and 1570 there were 278 noble feuds in Franconia alone. In the first half of the 15th century, feuding destroyed 1,200 villages, and the Hussite revolt a further 1,500. And remember that these are villages that have survived the utter devastation in the wake of the Black Death. Now, nobody can claim that in the 14th and 15th century the rest of Europe was an island of peace where everybody was holding hands and singing Kumbaya. The 100 Years' War, the War of the Roses, the battles between the Teutonic Knights and the Polish kings, the Reconquista, these were all epic struggles that ruined the countryside in very much the same way as they did in the empire. But all these conflicts were about the consolidation of central power. There was the King of France fighting against his major vassals, which included actually the King of England. And then in the War of the Roses, the King of England fought against the dukes. And then the Polish king fought against an independent state in the middle of his kingdom. So you get my drift. These wars ended with the victory of the kings, who established strong institutions that did, in the end, made the roads safe and stopped peasants being assaulted by the local lords. The problem in the empire was that there was no light at the end of the tunnel. One day the Markgraf of Brandenburg or the Count of Palatine would win your territory, but the next time the Duke of Bavaria or the Duke of Württemberg would take it away from them. There could never be a decisive victory that could bring all this mess to an end. Feuding and the ensuing misery for the peasant population had been a scourge for the empire for centuries. But what was it about the 15th century that made the call for reform so deafening they could no longer be ignored? Well, arguably there were two, or depending on how you count, three things that really changed during the 15th century. Firstly, up until the middle of the 15th century, the empire had no natural predators. There may be a mess internally, and the emperors were already very weak, but the gap to its neighboring kingdoms of France, Poland, Denmark, Hungary, it wasn't that huge. All these places, as discussed before, were going through a whole lot of upheaval themselves. But as they consolidated, the fringes of the empire now really came under threat. Provence, Dauphiné, Franche-Comté, Prussia, Holland, the Venetian mainland, even Austria was gradually swallowed up by these newly consolidated kingdoms. And the empire is still shell-shocked by the outcome of the Hussite Wars, where crusade after crusade is defeated in ever more humiliating fashion by the Bohemian peasant armies. If the flower of the German knighthood cannot even defeat these unwashed hillbillies, what if someone even better organized and even more powerful shows up on the border? And hey, there was exactly such a new kid on the block, a sort of bodybuilder kid kind of thing, the Turkish Sultan, who was rolling up the Balkans. So, for the first time since the Magyars had been defeated on the Lechfeld in 955, was there a genuine threat to the very existence of the empire. And these new threats emerged at a time when the cost of warfare exploded. Infantry tactics using pikes could now defeat cavalry, and that meant artillery had become a necessity. The best infantry troops were mercenaries, Bohemians, Swiss and German Landsknechte, who were expected to be paid handsomely. Founding cannon was a highly specialized skill, and even a simple field gun cost a multiple of what a typical knight would spend on his warhorse, sword and working armor. The defense of the empire could simply no longer be ensured by an occasional raising of the feudal levy. France and Hungary had created standing armies, and so had the Ottoman Sultan. So just taking him. The Janissaries counted to about 8,000 to 10,000 men. And then there was the permanent cavalry of roughly the same size. And in case of war, the Sultan could call on a multiple of that from the various regional governors, which arguably gave him 200,000 men. Now, he could never deploy all of them at the same time because the logistics would just not allow it. But still, there are 200,000 men. So, the empire had to keep pace. It's in the 12th and 13th century that the emperors would take maybe 5,000 to 10,000 men south. Charles VIII took 30,000 men to Italy. And as the Italian wars intensified, the armies of about 50,000 became the norm. By the early 16th century, 1 year of campaigning against the Ottomans cost somewhere between 1.8 million and 3.6 million florins. And then 2 decades later, the annual cost of the wars with France ran at about 5.5 million florins annually. And compare that to the income from the Imperial treasury, that was roughly 25,000 florins, though occasionally there were one-off subsidies that could be materially higher. So an emperor, even if he was a major territorial prince in his own right, could simply no longer protect the borders. Now, the full scale of the urgency may have not been clear to everybody in 1495, but it was understood that the current political structure of the empire had run out of road. That being said, there were actually still some rays of sunshine here. Because feuding and the threats to the territorial integrity of the empire had not been the biggest concern of the people in the beginning of the 15th century. Their number one issue had been the Great Western Schism, the fact that there were 3 popes who had all excommunicated each other, and then anyone who had followed their rivals, meaning that literally everybody in Europe had been excommunicated by at least 2 popes, giving them a 2 in 3 chance of hellfire. Now, this massive problem had been resolved by the Council of Constance that sat between 1414 and 1418, and that gave the people not only hope that even the most intractable of problems could be resolved, it also gave them the tools to do it with. A church council, as we laid out way back in the episodes 171-174, was the congregation of the faithful, whose authority superseded even that of the Pope. In other words, ideas that had circulated since at least Marsilius of Padua, namely that authority is based on the consent of the ruled, had found manifest expression and proved more effective in resolving the schism than the hapless attempts of the kings, cardinals, and emperors that went on before. So, it's therefore no surprise that the serious debate over imperial reform kicked off for good during the later stages of the Council of Basel, so that's around the 1430s. Now, this debate is, I think, quite unusual, since, that wasn't conducted in the context of gatherings like imperial assemblies or parliaments as it would have happened in the more centralized kingdoms of France or England. Because Germany was already so fragmented into dozens of important centers. Some were princely residences, others were free imperial cities, so that the debate had to be conducted in writing. That happened initially by copying the manuscripts by hand, but then Gutenberg made his great invention, and now many of these documents were printed and distributed widely. There were actually dozens of them, but most of them begin with an analysis of the dire state of the empire. Here is one commissioned by the Archbishop of Trier in 1452, quote, "We perceive that there is neither peace, nor justice, nor prosecution of the law anywhere in the empire's affairs. There are many wanton conflicts, disobediences of subjects towards their lords, robberies, arsons, murders, thefts on the roads, feuds and enmities, without any justice or integrity. Neither freedom nor peace is anywhere to be found. Any given prince must defend himself with his own might. When he pursues peace or war in one place, new disputes instantly begin elsewhere. It is constantly necessary for princes, counts, lords, nobles, and other good people to prepare for battle, or to pay money to avoid being attacked. It follows from this that the principalities are decayed and ruined through pledging, destruction, base and sinful usury, and other day-to-day futile, pernicious, great and severe costs. In the same way, counties, lordships, monasteries, and collegiate churches are also reduced to extreme poverty and ruin, and the more prestige and temporal goods they have, the greater the damage they suffer. From this also follows that the Roman Empire, the emperor, the princes, and all the German nation is now considered the least by all other nations. It therefore seems to me to be necessary to consider a means to raise up the empire and to put in order the matters of the empire." End quote. The analysis was the part that everybody agreed on. It was the solution that was contentious. As I said, there are dozens or so major documents that are considered part of this debate and have influenced the imperial reform process, though I would assume there were loads more that probably didn't cut that deep. In a very broad way, they fall into three camps. There's number one, mega, make the emperor great again. In 1437, a paper appeared that proclaimed to be the reforms of the Emperor Sigismund, though it is very, very unlikely that he actually wrote it. For that, the language is just a little bit too fruity. The author does not hold back when he lays into the corruption and selfishness of the imperial princes. He's also, interestingly, very much against the imperial free cities, who he blames for not paying enough taxes, which is a bit odd given that they were the only ones who did actually pay any taxes. Anyway, he says that when the heads of the church and the empire are confronted with their injustices, they, quote, turn their asses to us. That's not quite the tone of the imperial chancery. However, his solution might have been quite popular with the emperor, because it went back to the great and powerful emperors of the early Middle Ages. He suggests that the princes, both the temporal and the spiritual ones, should return all the lands, tolls, mints, mining rights, everything that had once belonged to the empire. And then, of course, the emperor would now have all the resources needed to deliver peace and justice and to protect the realm. This was, of course, never going to happen. But the reforms of the Emperor Sigismund remained in print throughout the 15th and 16th century and enjoyed a lot of support amongst the lower classes, largely because it declared the following, quote, "It is an unheard of outrage, a great ongoing injustice which ought to be publicized to all of Christendom, that some are so spiritually impoverished before God that they speak thus to their fellow human, whom God has powerfully redeemed and freed. You are my property. This is a heathen way of behaving. God has redeemed us from all bonds, and henceforth nobody should haughtily exalt themselves into any position of ownership over another." End quote. Who would disagree with that? And further, this idea that their renewed imperial power could right all the wrongs done to serfs and peasants, that was an important factor in the various uprisings and then finally in the Peasants' War. Now, these proposals probably went a bit too far, but there were others in the same camp that had more moderate suggestions to create an effective imperial executive, and they enjoyed quite a lot of support. And then there's the next camp, which basically said, let a dozen oligarchs bloom. This position was first articulated in the policy paper issued by the Archbishop of Trier in 1452 that I have already quoted before. Here the Archbishop proposed that every year the Emperor and the electors should come together in a city in the center of the Reich and there establish a court. At this court, all decisions about war, peace and justice were to be taken. And as for the inner workings of this organization, he says, quote, "Each and everything required for this establishment of justice and organization of the Emperor's court should be properly ordained by us, the electors, and the councillors whom we appoint for this purpose." End quote. So here the idea is to set up a sort of oligarchy that runs the empire, keeps the peace, establishes a system of courts to resolve disputes, bans feuding, and raises army for the defense of the realm, as and when needed. The name of this structure was the Reichsregiment, which is best translated as the imperial government. In this scenario, the emperor was then just a senior member of the imperial government with some ceremonial duties and maybe the nominal, maybe even the actual command of the army in case of war. There again are variations to this theme differing around the question of who is going to be a member of the imperial government. There were, after all, a number of very powerful imperial princes who were not electors, like the Dukes of Bavaria, Württemberg and Brunswick, Holstein, and the Landgrafs of Hessen, just to name a few. And these princes were disinclined to be ruled by the 7 electors as much as they resented the imperial interference in their affairs. Which gets me to the third proposed solution: be more pope. Now, this proposal originated with somebody called Nicholas von Kues, who was one of the most influential theologians and thinkers of the age. Kues took inspiration from the church councils in Constance and Basel. These were the events that had given people the hope that these difficulties of the empire could actually be resolved in the first place. So for him, the Reichstag, very much like a church council, should represent the constituent parts of the empire, decide the laws, and have the ultimate say in how the empire was to be run. The Reichstag should then convene annually, and a committee should be formed by the Reichstag that could exercise its right during the time that the Reichstag wasn't actually sitting. But Cusanus didn't want to replace the emperor with an imperial government like the Archbishop of Trier did in the previous example, because in the same way as the church council didn't want to replace the pope, he believed that the empire needed a strong executive power to deliver peace and justice. And so the emperor should still command a standing imperial army funded by imperial tax. He would direct the 4 imperial vicars, which were based in Brabant, Austria, Milan, and Savoy, and who would administrate the 4 regions or circles of the empire. And next, an eternal peace that banned feuding would be passed by the Reichstag, and a system of courts would be established. Decisions of the courts would then be enforced by the imperial vicar or the emperor himself. So, these are the three options. You could return to the good old days of Otto the Great. You could create an imperial government made up of electors and maybe princes. And third, there's a sort of middle way, where we end up with the Reichstag and the emperor working together, one's focusing more on passing the rules and the other more at enforcing these decisions, in particular the ban on feuding and the defense of the empire. Fascinating as this debate amongst clerics and intellectuals may be, this does not solve the problem, well, unless somebody does something. As you may remember from the previous seasons, efforts had been made to bring about imperial reform. The electors deposed Wenceslas the Lazy for incompetence, replaced him with Ruprecht of the Palatinate in the hope that he could do a little bit better. Then neither he nor the next one, Sigismund, moved things on. They planned to depose Sigismund as well, but failed to agree on a candidate for his succession. Still, attempts at establishing a general imperial tax were made, but that petered out again quite rapidly. All that is in episode 179, by the way. There was then a lot of enthusiasm when Friedrich III came in and established a Kammergericht as an imperial court staffed with professional judges, but that again evaporated rapidly. I think that's episode 209. In the 1450s and 1460s, several princes, guided by Martin Meyer, attempted to reform the empire by replacing Friedrich III with a more suitable or malleable candidate. Various names were floated, including Friedrich the Victorious of the Palatinate and Georg von Podiebrad, the King of Bohemia. But neither of these schemes came to fruition. In the 30 years before the Diet of Worms in 1495, the debate gradually turned into a standoff. The princes demanded action, and in 1467 Friedrich III passed a time-limited Landfrieden or general peace and re-established the Kammergericht. However, that did not materially reduce feuding, because again, the Kammergericht judges often went without pay, and then Friedrich III lacked the resources to enforce any of these judgments. And after that, things really ground to a complete halt. Every time the estates demanded more significant change, Friedrich III refused to even debate it, at which point the princes refused any help in the various wars and conflicts, except for the really obvious cases where they couldn't get away, like at Neuss or when Maximilian was imprisoned in Bruges. The 19th century came down really hard on Friedrich III. They blamed the continued delay in German statehood on his intransigence. However, since the princely proposals were usually along the lines of what the Archbishop of Trier proposed in 1452, aka they were asking for a complete emasculation of the emperor and the establishment of a princely imperial government. So I can understand why he kept going, "Niet." Or, because he was Austrian, he said more, "Nah." Maximilian, on the other hand, was more inclined to discuss imperial reform. He could see that his father's strategy had ultimately run out of road. He had fought the French on the western border for a decade, and his dream was to go up against the Turk. And there was no way he could do that without the support of the imperial estates. And the only way to ensure consistent support from the estates was by establishing new institutions and a taxation model. Therefore, when he was elected in 1486, he gave some subtle, or actually not very subtle, hints that he was ready to negotiate. But he could never really act on this, since his father stepped in every time Maximilian was about to make concessions. And that is why really nothing happened until 1495. But in 1495, Friedrich III minus half a leg was safely 3 feet under, and therefore the real discussion could begin. Maximilian called on the imperial estates to assemble in Worms on February 2nd, 1495. When he did that, he hadn't really intended to make that event a debate about imperial reform. All he wanted was 2 weeks to get together, at the end of which the estates would grant him 2 things. An immediate subsidy to raise an army to go after King Charles VIII of France, who had invaded the empire in Italy, and ideally a longer term, say a 10 or 12-year commitment to fund a standing army for the defense against the Turks. Now, as usual, Maximilian was late. When he got to Worms on March 18th, There's hardly anyone there. It took another 10 days before enough princes were assembled to form a quorum. Maximilian made a speech, said, "Give me the money now, it's urgent. The French are already in Naples." This went down like a lead balloon. The still rather small audience was taken aback by the speech. Maximilian had not mentioned the imperial reform at all. Not a single word, not even a gentle nod in the general direction. Why? This was the first gathering after Friedrich III's death. Of course we should discuss imperial reform now. So they stalled. They said, "We should wait until more princes are here." It took until April 7th for all the ultimately 147 participants to make their way to Worms. There are 5 of the 7 electors, 29 temporal princes, and 10 spiritual lords who had come in person, and then there are further 12 that had sent their representatives. And then we have 67 counts and imperial knights and 24 imperial cities, all present. Maximilian is now actually seriously twitchy. He was not prepared for some longish constitutional debate. Literally a week ago, his envoys had signed up with the Holy League, and his new Italian and Spanish allies expected him to come down to Italy with an army and help trap the King of France in Naples. He also had another couple of irons in the fire. There's Perkin Warbeck, the Yorkist pretender that was recruiting an army for his landing in England. And that army was paid for by Maximilian and his mother-in-law Margaret of York, and was sailing in July of that same year. And then there was still the rest of the Burgundian War going on in Guelders, where the French supported a claim to the duchy. So Maximilian really needed to get this done, and quick. But that was not easy. The princes, bishops, counts, knights and cities who had gathered in Worms believed, well, it was now or never for them. Maximilian's father was dead, and the new king should now engage in the long overdue reforms, and moreover, they had him by the short and curlies. Plus, if they would give him the money now, and he would go off and defeat the French, go to Rome, get crowned emperor, and then return as a victorious hero, well, then it would take decades before they get to nail him down again. So, they stalled once again. They took the imperial funding proposals and pretended they were debating them. But in reality, they discussed what imperial reforms they would demand of Maximilian. After a few weeks, no progress, Maximilian realized that his schedule was no longer achievable. He called the estates, asked them what they wanted, and they presented him with a document outlining a range of reforms they wanted to discuss. These looked aspirational but not excessive, and Maximilian reluctantly agreed that the Reichstag would now debate imperial reform. Now, to understand what happened next, we have to take a quick look at the way the Reichstag makes its decisions. The Reichstag is not a parliament where everybody is in one room and debates the issues of the day. The Reichstag is actually 3 separate colleges, one for the electors, one for the imperial princes and the counts, and the third one for the cities. The process starts with an imperial proposal that sets the agenda. The proposal then goes into each of the colleges, where the members of each college discuss it behind closed doors and then vote on how they want to respond. Then the 3 colleges compare their respective opinions and debate and revise them until they arrive at a unanimous opinion of all 3 colleges, which is then presented to the emperor. The emperor can then either agree or reject it, and if he rejects it, it goes back to the colleges and the whole process starts again. This process takes ages. And it was also heavily tilted in favor of the electors and the major territorial princes, because their 2 colleges would coordinate their opinions before they go and show them to the college of the cities, who could then only get smaller adjustments through. And secondly, the smaller entities, the counts, abbots, abbesses, and imperial knights, had to pool their votes, weighing no more than the vote of one of the princes. And then the peasants were, of course, not represented at all. And the worst thing for the emperor was that he was not allowed to be present at any of these meetings. He was literally hopping mad outside the closed doors as the King of France was slipping through his fingers. And because it was complex and involved a lot of chats in corridors and meetups in side rooms, it required somebody to manage the process. And that could by definition not be the emperor because he wasn't even allowed to be in the room. So enter stage left, Berthold von Henneberg, Archbishop of Mainz. Now Berthold's been painted as Maximilian's great adversary who fought for the rights of the estates against a recalcitrant ruler unwilling to pass any reforms. Well, that's probably inaccurate. Berthold was, like many other bishops and abbots, very keen on a permanent peace and an effective ban on feuding. As we have seen in the example of Mainz, the largely defenseless church territories were under constant attack from rapacious princes. And he also believed that an imperial government would be much better able to achieve law and order than the emperor. Just look at what happened the last 100 years. But he wasn't a revolutionary flying the flag of liberty in the face of tyranny. He was more the guy who sort of brokered the compromise the estates could bring to the emperor. So, with all the preliminaries out of the way, we can now look at what actually happened. So I think the whole procedure breaks down into 3 separate phases. So there's phase 1, we've already discussed in a bit, which lasted from March 18th to April 27, 1495. In that phase, Maximilian pushed for his initial proposal to give him all the money and maybe discuss imperial reform later. Instead, they presented him with a counter-proposal to first discuss a permanent peace, the establishment or revival of the courts, the Kammergericht, and the Reichsregiment, the imperial government. Once that has been agreed, they would be happy to discuss the funding of the army and the taxation. Maximilian resented the idea of an imperial government where the electors had a huge amount of power, but given where he was with all the pressure to get things done in time, he agreed to proceed on this basis. Which gets us to phase 2, which lasted from April 27th to June 22nd. So as described above, the Reichstag setup and the process is heavily skewed to the electors and the imperial princes. And the electors and the imperial princes, they know that Maximilian is under massive pressure. So, they ransacked the sweet shop. What the Reichstag presents on May 18, 1495 to the emperor was a princely fever dream. They propose an imperial government made up of 17 representatives that would be given full control of the state. They would handle finance, domestic and foreign policy, defense, law and order, justice and even legislation. In this imperial government, the emperor would have only 3 out of the 17 votes. And a particularly misjudged slight, the Habsburg duchies did not even have a permanent seat in this government. What enraged Maximilian even more, if that is at all possible, was that the conduct of external war was taken away from him completely. The imperial government was to appoint an imperial captain who would raise the troops, appoint the officers, manage logistics, and lead in battle. If that had gone through, that would have turned the emperor into a completely powerless figurehead, wheeled out on special occasions looking fancy in his crown and gown. It also did not help that the proposal came with a whole host of accusations that Maximilian and his predecessor presided over a century of decay and loss of territory. And since the emperors had let so many lands go, the burden on those who had remained was now exorbitant. So before he asked for more money, he should go and collect the outstanding dues from Provence and the Rhone Valley and the Low Countries. Obviously, there is no way in the world, or outside it, that Maximilian would side on to this. They tried to sweeten the deal a little bit by granting him 100,000 florins to raise an army, but that was less than the 150,000 he had asked for, and as we will see, will only be paid when it was far too late. When he received these proposals on May 25th, he called them for what they were: blackmail. He was so angry he did not even respond for almost a month. Instead, he just pretended there was no Reichstag going on at all. He invested Ludovico il Moro as Duke of Milan without asking the electors. He negotiated with the Swiss about hiring mercenaries for a war against the French and the Turks. Having spent weeks jumping up and down outside the council chamber of the Reichstag, now he let the princes walk by his chamber, wondering what the king would do next. It must have been a true feat of self-discipline not to go and beg for money. With every day that passed, the chances to meet his international commitments and to catch the King of France were dwindling away. But there is no way he could hand over the crown of the empire to the princes just for that. There is more of his old man in Maximilian than appears at first sight. And Maximilian wasn't idle. He seeded discontent amongst the estates. Because not everyone was that keen on an all-powerful imperial government dominated by the prince-electors. All the small entities, the counts, the abbots, the cities, the imperial knights, well, they feared quite rightly that they would be swallowed up by the larger territorial princes. But even some of the most powerful dukes, the ones of Bavaria and Saxony, were unhappy with the limitations to what was right now almost complete autonomy. So slowly but surely, the consensus over a princely oligarchy was falling apart. The first indication that the princes were about to cave came when they revised their proposals for the permanent peace and for the process for the imperial court, the Kammergericht. These were all topics where the two sides actually had a lot of common ground. These proposals then became the basis on which quite productive negotiations continued for the rest of the Reichstag while everything else was happening above. But on the issue of imperial government, there was not a peep out of Maximilian's office until, almost a month later, on June 22nd, he sent a revised version of the Reichstag proposals back to the colleges. He had taken their text and then just simply flipped words, so that, for instance, the imperial government was to be staffed not by princes, but by people the emperor chose. It would be based not in Frankfurt, but at the imperial court. Whole sections he did not approve of, like the section on the imperial captain and the conduct of war, well, he simply dropped. So all that went back to the Reichstag for further debate, which kicks off phase 3. We are now at the end of June. The Battle of Fornovo took place on July 8th. So Charles VIII was actually already home and dry. Perkin Warbeck's landing in England had ended in a total disaster. The guy didn't even get ashore before a small army was decimated. And Gelders can always wait for another year. So basically, the power of blackmail the estates had over Maximilian was gone. The ball is now in the king's court. Now he can use time to force concessions. And so, on June 28, the electors and the princes give up their idea of an imperial government that replaces the emperor. Instead, they agree to something called the Handhabung, that laid down some rules about a governing council and the Reichstag procedure that, however, would soon be revised. And whilst all this back and forth over power in the empire went on, a few unsung heroes managed to forge an agreement between all the parties involved that would actually stand the test of time. The Ewige Landfrieden, the eternal peace which at least formally ended feuding in the empire, the Kammergerichtsordnung, the procedural for the professional imperial court, and the common penny, the tax that was meant to fund all these institutions. Some of these were real breakthroughs that stayed on the statute book until 1806, others were a little bit less successful and replaced, but 1495 marked a huge step towards the curious constitutional structure that we call the Holy Roman Empire. And how these worked exactly, how they impacted the empire in the long run, and ultimately the development of Germany, is what we're going to discuss next week. I hope you will join us again. And as always, if you feel this show serves a purpose that you feel is worth supporting, go to historyofthegermans.com/support, where you'll find all sorts of exciting ways to keep me in my seat chatting about long-forgotten empires. And a big thank you to Duncan Hardy, whose translations of key documents are used extensively in this episode. You can find a link to his excellent book in Travel, Maps and Books section of my website.